Hello, all you lovelies. This is B, and we're back again with your favorite pastime. Uh, Probably not pastime, reading buddy, but we're gonna lie and say so. Um, we're back with Five Nights at Freddy's: The Twisted Ones, and we're gonna go right into it and start with. Sorry, I got distracted. Start with chapter 6. So, Charlie slowed her car. With half of the cops and Hurricane converging on the area, now was not the time to be stopped for speeding. She was grubby with dirt from the dead woman's backyard, and had a nagging feeling there was something she was forgetting about. John, she realized. She was supposed to meet him. She checked the clock on the dashboard almost 2 hours ago. Her heart sank. He'll think I stood him up. No, he'll think I'm dead, she amended. Given the perilous history of their relationship, he'd probably think the second was more likely. When she got to the restaurant where they had planned to meet, a small Italian place across town, Charlie ran in from the parking lot at full speed. She skidded to a stop in front of the teenage hostess, who greeted her with a flustered look. "Can I help you?" she asked Charlie, taking a step back. Charlie caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror behind the hostess's counter. There were streaks of dirt on her face and clothes. She hadn't thought to clean up first. She quickly wiped her cheeks with her hands before answering the girl. "I'm supposed to be meeting someone, a tall guy, brown hair. It's kind of," she gestured vaguely at the top of her head, attempting to indicate the habitual chaos of John's hair, but the hostess looked at her blankly. Charlie bit her lip in frustration. "He must have left. Of course he left. You're 2 hours late." "Charlie," a voice rang out. "John." "You're still here?" she cried too loud for the quiet restaurant as he appeared behind the hostess, looking profoundly relieved. "I figured I might as well eat while I'm here." He swallowed what was in his mouth and laughed. "Are you okay? I thought you might not be coming." "I'm fine. Where are you sitting? Or are you still sitting?" "Well, I mean, you're obviously not sitting. You're standing. But I mean, before you were standing. Where were you sitting?" Charlie ran her fingers into her hair and clenched her fists against her scalp, trying to reassemble her thoughts. She mumbled an apology to the room, not sure who it was for. John glanced around nervously, then gestured towards a table near the kitchen. There was mostly an empty plate with a half-eaten breadstick resting on it, a cup of coffee in a second-place setting, untouched. They sat down and he looked at her appraisingly. Then John leaned across the table and asked in a low voice, "Charlie, what happened?" "You wouldn't believe me if I told you," she said lightly. His face remained concerned. "You're filthy. Did you fall down in the parking lot?" "Yes," Charlie said. "I fell in the parking lot and rolled down a hill into a dumpster. Then fell out of the dumpster and tripped on the way in. Happy? Stop looking at me like that." "Like what?" "Like you had the right to disapprove of me." John pulled back in his chair, his eyes wide. He blinked hard, and Charlie sighed. "John, I'm sorry. I'll tell you everything. I just need some time. Some time to collect my thoughts and to clean up." She laughed, an exhausted, shaken sound, then buried her face in her hands. John leaned back and signaled for the waitress to bring the check. Breathing heavily, Charlie looked around the restaurant. It was almost empty. The hostess and the only other waitress was walking together near the door, with no apparent interest in anything their customers were doing. There was a family of 4 by the front window, the children just barely out of the toddlerhood. One kept sliding out of his chair and onto the floor every time his mother turned her attention away. The other, a girl, was happily drawing on the tablecloth with markers. No one seemed to care what was going on, but the emptiness made Charlie feel exposed. "I'm gonna go clean up," she said. "Bathroom?" John pointed. Charlie got up and left the table just as the waitress arrived to deliver his ticket. There was a payphone in the hallway, and Charlie stopped at it, wavering. She craned her neck to see if John was watching, but from where she stood, she could only see a tiny corner of the table. Quickly, she called Clay Burke's office. To her surprise, he answered. "You saw our backyard?" he said. It wasn't a question. "Can you give me the other addresses?" Charlie asked. "There could be a pattern. Something." There sure could," he said dryly. Oh. "That's why I raced back to the station instead of sticking around to measure the holes. You have a pen?" "Hang on." The hostess was briefly absent from her station, and Charlie dropped the phone, letting it swing on its metal cord as she hurried to the podium and snatched a pen and a takeout menu. She rushed back. Clay, go ahead. He recited the names and addresses, and she scribbled them dustfully in the margins of the menu. Thank you, she said when he was done, and hung up without waiting for him to respond. She folded the menu and slipped it into her back pocket. In the bathroom, Charlie washed off as much of the dirt as she could. She couldn't even clean her clothing, but at least her face was scrubbed. Her hair was rearranged a little more neatly. As she moved to exit the bathroom, an image flashed about unbidden through her thoughts. It was the face of the dead woman. She could be your twin, she heard Clay say in his low, authoritative voice. She shook her head. It's a coincidence. He's right. How many brown-haired, college-aged women are there around here? The first victim was a man. It doesn't mean anything. She grabbed the doorknob to leave, but froze. It was just like in the library. Charlie released the knob, and it spun slowly back into position, releasing a horrible creak as it moved. The costumes had been disturbed, and the creaking noise was faint and careful. She scarcely even heard it. Charlie looked up from her game. There was a figure in the door. Charlie glanced wildly around the room, pulling herself back to the present. With a swell of panic, Charlie pulled on the bathroom door, but it had somehow sealed shut. She mouthed words, but no sound came out. I know you're there. I'm trying to get to you. I have to get inside, she screamed. The door busted open. Charlie fell into John's arms. Charlie! She collapsed to her knees. Charlie looked up to see the scattered handful of customers still staring at her. John glanced into the bathroom behind her, then quickly turned his attention back to Charlie, helping her to her feet. I'm okay. I'm fine. She shook loose of his hands. I'm fine. The door was stuck. I felt hot. Charlie fanned at her face, trying to make a sensible story of it. Come on, let's get to the car. He tried to take her arm again, but she shook free. I'm fine. She dug her keys out of her pocket and walked straight for the door, not waiting for him. An old woman was openly staring at Charlie, her fork suspended in the air. Charlie returned her stare. Food poisoning, Charlie said plainly. The woman's face went pale, and Charlie walked out the door. When they got out to the car, John sat down in the passenger seat and looked at Charlie expectantly. You sure you're okay? It's been a rough day, that's all. I'm sorry. What happened? Tell him what happened, Charlie thought. I want to go to my dad's, my old house, she said instead, surprising herself. Be honest, her inner voice said harshly. You know what kind of creature is doing this, and you know who built it. Stay focused. Right, he said, his voice softening. I haven't seen it since the storm. She nodded. He thinks I want to see the damage. She'd forgotten about the storm until now, but the sudden kindness in John's voice made her nervous. Is there anything left? She imagined the house razed to the ground and felt a sudden wrongness, like part of her had been ripped away. She'd never thought of the house as anything but a house, but now as she drove towards what was left of it, she felt a painful knot in her stomach. It was where all her clearest memories of her father were kept. His rough hands building her toys, showing her his new creations in the workshop, and holding her close when she was afraid. They lived there together, just the two of them, and it was the place where he had finally died. Charlie felt as if the joy, the sorrow, the love, and the anguish of their 2 lifetimes had poured off into the very bones of the old house. The idea of it being wrecked by a storm was utter violation. She shook her hand and gripped the wheel tighter, and suddenly aware of how angry she was. Her love of the house, even of her father, could never be simple. They had both betrayed her. But now there was a new monster out there. She clenched her jaw, trying to fight the tears that welled up in her eyes. Dad, what did you do? As soon as they were out of the town center, Charlie sped up. Clay would be tied up with dealing with the newest victim for a while, but eventually he would think to come to her father's house as well. She could only hope that she connected the dots first. You're on the same side. Charlie put a hand on her head and rubbed her temple. The impulse to guard her father's reputation from what was coming was visceral, but it was also nonsensical. Nonsensical. Less than a mile from the house, they passed a construction site. It was set back too far from the road for Charlie to see what it was, though it looked abandoned at the moment. I did a little work over there when I first got here, John said. Some huge demolition project, he laughed. You have some weird stuff out here. You wouldn't know by looking at it. He studied the countryside for a moment. Isn't that the truth? Charlie said, not sure if there was something else she was supposed to say. She was still trying to calm herself. Finally, they came to her driveway. She pulled in with her eyes on the gravel, the house only a dark smudge in her peripheral vision. The last time Charlie had been here, she'd run in and out without pausing to look at anything. All she wanted was Theodore, and she had grabbed him and gone. Now she regretted her haste, wishing for some final mental image. You're not here to say goodbye. She turned the car off, steeled herself, and looked up. The house was surrounded by trees, and at least 3 of them had fallen, striking the roof directly. One had landed squarely on the front corner, crushing the walls beneath its weight. Charlie could see through the broken beams and crumbled drywall into the living room. Inside there was only debris. The front door was intact, though the steps to it were splintered and split. They looked as if they'd give away as soon as they bore weight. Charlie got out of the car and headed towards them. What are you doing? John was alarmed. Charlie ignored him. She heard his door slam, and he caught her arm, wrenching her back. What? She snapped. Charlie, look at this place. This house is going to fall over any day now. It's not going to fall, she said flatly, but she did gaze up again. The house seemed to be listening to the side, though it must have been an illusion. Surely the foundation itself wouldn't have sunk. I'll get out before I get killed. I promise. She said more gently, and he nodded. Go slow, he said. They carefully climbed the steps to the porch, staying close to the sides, but the wood was sturdier than it looked. They could have taken 3 steps to the right and walked through the open wall, but Charlie took out her key and unlocked the door as John waited patiently, letting her go through the unnecessary ritual. Inside, she paused at the front of the stairs to the 2nd floor. The holes in the ceiling were beaming down shafts of thin sunlight, dimming as the sun began to wane. It made the place feel almost like some sort of shrine. Charlie tore her eyes away from the holes and started upstairs to her bedroom. As with the outdoor steps, she kept to the side, holding on to the banister. The water damage was visible everywhere. There were dark stains and soft spots in the wood. Charlie reached out to touch a place where the paint had bubbled out from the wall, leaving a pocket of air. Suddenly, a cracking sound came from behind her, and she spun around. John grabbed the banister, struggling to hold on as the stair gave away under him. Charlie reached out, but John braced himself unsteadily. He hissed and gritted his teeth. My foot's stuck, he said, nodding down. Charlie saw that his foot had gone clear through the wood, and now the jagged edges dug into his ankle. Okay, hold on, Charlie said. She crouched down until she could reach him on the step below her, though the awkward angle made it hard to maintain her balance. The wood was only rotting in some places, while in others it was still intact. She grabbed the smaller pieces and pulled them cautiously back from John's foot, her hands growing raw with the rough and splintered surfaces. I think I got it, John said finally, flexing his ankle. She looked up and grinned. And you thought I was going to get myself killed? John gave her a weak smile. How about we both make it out alive? Right. They made their way up the rest of the stairs, much more slowly, each of them testing their weight before they took the next step. Careful, John warned as Charlie reached the top. We won't be here long, Charlie said. She was much more aware of the danger now. The house instability grew more obvious with each step they took. The very foundation seemed to wobble from side to side as they moved. Her old bedroom was on the undamaged side of the house, or the side not struck by trees, at least. Charlie stopped in the doorway, and John came up behind her. The floor was strewn with glass. One window had been broken by something, and shattered glass had blown into the room. She took a deep breath, and it was then she saw Stanley. The animatronic unicorn had once run on a track around her bedroom. Now he was lying on his side. Charlie went to him and sat down, pulling his head into her lap and patting his rusty cheek. He looked as if he'd been torn violently from his track. His legs were twisted, his hoofs missing chunks. When she looked around the room, she saw the missing pieces still attached to the grooves in the floor. Stanley has seen better days, John smiled ruefully. Yeah, Charlie said absently as she set the toy's head back on the floor. John, can you turn that wheel? She pointed to the crank soldered together at the floor of her bed. She pointed to a crank. Oh, I misread that. He complied, crossing the floor agonizingly slow. Charlie bit back her impatience. He turned the crank and she waited for the little closet door to open, but nothing happened. John looked at Charlie expectantly. She stood and went to the wall where the 3 closets stood, closed and apparently untouched by the weather. Even the paint was bright and immaculate. Charlie hesitated, feeling as though she might be disturbing something that no longer belonged to her, then forced the smallest door open. Ella was there, the doll who had been the same size as Charlie when she was much younger. She, like Stanley, had once run around on the track, and she seemed still to be attached to it. She was entirely undamaged. Her dress was clean, and the tray she held in front of her was firm in her motionless hands. Her eyes had been gazing into the darkness since the last time Charlie saw her. "Hi, Ella," Charlie said softly. "I don't suppose you can tell me what I'm looking for." She scanned over the doll quickly and brushed at her dress. "You just want to stay in here from now on?" Charlie studied the tiny frame of the door. "I don't blame you." She closed the door again without saying goodbye. "So," she said, turning to John. He seemed lost in thought, staring at something in his hand. "What is that?" Charlie asked. "A photo of you, when you were no bigger than her." John smiled and gestured toward Ella's door, then handed the picture to Charlie. It looked like a school photo. A short, chubby girl gave a toothy grin for the camera, minus 1 tooth. Charlie smiled back at her. "I don't remember this." "That doll is a little creepy standing in the closet," John said. "I'm a bit on edge, I won't lie." "Waiting for a tea party," Charlie said acrobically. "How sinister." She started to leave the room, but as her hand touched the doorframe, she paused. Doors. She stepped back into her bedroom and looked for a long moment at each of the rectangular closet doors. "John?" she whispered. "What?" John looked up, trying to follow Charlie's gaze. "Doors," she whispered. She took several long steps back to study the whole wall at once. The scribbles all over her notebooks had been shaped like dozens, hundreds of rectangles. She drew them without thinking, as if they were pushing up through her mind, trying to break out of her subconscious. Now they had. "They're doors," she repeated. "Yes, I see." John tilted his head curiously. "Are you okay?" "Yes, I'm fine. I mean, I'm not sure." She ran her eyes over the walls of the closets again. "Doors, but not these doors." "Come on, let's go look at the workshop," John said. "Maybe we can find something else there." "Right." She gave a pained smile. She looked back once more at the 3 closets that sat in silence. John nodded, and they went cautiously back to the stairs, testing each step before they took it. Outside, they stopped by the car. Workshop was invisible from the driveway, hidden behind the house. The backyard once been surrounded by trees, a small wood that acted as a fence. "Don't go into the woods, Charlie," she said, then smiled at John. "That's what he always told me, like something out of a fairy tale." They walked a bit further, twigs snapping under their feet. But the woods were only 10 feet deep, she said, still peering into the trees, as though something might leap out. As a child, these trees had seemed impenetrable, a forest she might be lost in forever if she dared to wander in. She stared towards what remained of them, then stopped dead when she saw where some of the fallen trees had landed. Her father's workshop had been crushed. A massive trunk had hit the workshop's roof dead center, and others had with it on all sides. The wall closet to the house was still standing, but it was bowed beneath the sagging roof. It had been a garage when they moved in, and then it had become her father's world, a place of light and shadow that smelled of hot metal and burnt plastic. Charlie peered down at the rotting wood and broken glass with careful attention, looking for something she might otherwise miss. "We're definitely not going in there," John said. But Charlie was already lifting a piece of sheet metal that had once belonged to the roof. She threw it violently to the side and it hit the ground with a resounding clang. John startled and kept his distance as Charlie continued to throw things. What are we looking for?" Charlie wrestled a toy from under the debris and threw it carelessly to the ground behind her, continuing to lift sheets of metal and toss them aside. "Charlie," John whispered, picking up a delicate toy and cradling it. "He must have made this for you." Charlie ignored him. There's got to be something in here. She fought her way deeper into the workshop, toppling a wooden beam out of her way. Her hand slipped on the wood, and she realized it was wet. Her arm was bleeding. She wiped her hand on her jeans. From the corner of her eye, she saw John set the toy carefully on the ground and follow her in. Amazingly, there were still shelves and tables standing upright, with tools and shreds of fabric where her father had last set them. Charlie glanced at them for a passing moment, then swept her arms across the table nearest her, knocking everything to the ground. She didn't pause to see what had fallen before moving to the shelves. She began picking things off the nearest shelf, one item at a time, inspecting them and throwing them to the ground. When the shelf was empty, she grabbed the board itself with both hands, wrenching at it violently, trying to pull it from the wall. When it didn't come loose, she began pounding at it with her fist. "Stop!" John ran to her and grabbed her hands, pinning them to her sides. "There has to be something here," she screamed. "I'm supposed to be here, but I don't know what it is I'm supposed to find." "What are you talking about? There's not a lot left. Look at this stuff." He held the toy up to her again. This isn't about the storm, John. It's not about happy memories or closure or whatever you think I need. This is about monsters. They're out there, and they're killing people. And you and I both know there is only one place they could have come from. Here." "You don't know that," John began. Charlie looked at him with a stony rage, stopping him short. "I'm surrounded by monsters and a murderer and death and spirits." At the last word, her fury ebbed, and she turned away from John, surveying the workshop. She wasn't sure now what damage Storm had done and what had been her. "All I can think about is Sammy. I feel him right now. I can feel him in this place, but he's cut off. It doesn't even make sense. He died before my father and I moved here, but I know I'm here for a reason. There's something that I'm supposed to find. It's all connected, but I don't know how. Maybe something to do with the doors? I don't know." "Hey, okay, we'll find it together." John reached for Charlie. Charlie's strength gave way, and she let him pull her close, pressing her face into his shirt. "I know it's hard to see everything torn apart like this," he said. Charlie's anger drained away, fading into exhaustion. She rested her head on John's shoulder, wishing she could stay like this just a little longer. "Charlie," John said with alarm, and Charlie came back to attention. He was looking over his shoulder in the direction of the house. The entire back of the house had been torn open, as if someone had taken a massive hammer to it. Inside was only dark. "That's right under your room, isn't it? What could have fallen through the floor?" John said. "That should be the living room," Charlie said, wiping her sleeve across her face. "Yeah, but it's not." John looked at her expectantly. "That's not even a part of the house," she said. A sudden spark of hope revived inside her. Something was out of place. That meant there was something to find. Charlie approached the chasm, and John didn't try to stop her as she climbed up several large slabs of broken concrete. John stayed a few steps behind her, close enough to catch her if she slipped. Charlie turned to him before entering. "Thank you," she said, and John nodded. "I've never seen this room before," Charlie whispered as she crept into the hollow space. The walls were made of dark concrete, and the room was small and windowless. A box jammed into the house, sealed away between the rooms. There was no decorations and nothing to indicate what was stored there. Just a dirt floor and 3 large holes, deep, oblong, like graves. "Those don't look like storm damage," John said. "They're not." Charlie went up to the edge of the nearest hole, looking down. "Were you expecting to find these?" These holes were deeper than the ones she found at Tracy Horton's house. Perhaps it was a shadowy room, but these looked like real graves. They were a foot or so deeper than the ones she found before, and partially filled with loose dirt. John was standing patiently behind her, waiting for her to answer. "I've seen them before," she admitted, "behind the house of a dead woman." "What are you talking about?" Charlie sighed. "There was another body. I found her today in a field. I called Clay, and then I went to her house while he waited for the rest of the cops to show up. There were holes like this in her backyard." "That's what you wouldn't tell me? Another body?" John sounded hurt, but his wounded expression lasted only a second before it cleared. He started scanning the room again, his eyes intent on the walls and floor. That, and the fact that she looked like me, Charlie thought. "So what do you think the holes are?" he asked firmly. Charlie barely heard him. Her gaze had fixed on the blank concrete wall on the far side of the room. It was empty, whitewashed, then left to turn gray with dust and mildew. But something drew her to it. Leaving John alone by the open graves, Charlie walked slowly to it, drawn there by a sense of sudden recognition. It was like she just remembered a word that had been on the tip of her tongue for days. She hesitated, holding her hands flat, less than an inch from the wall, uncertain what was holding her back. She steeled herself and placed her palms against the wall. It was cold. She felt a slight shock of surprise, as though she expected to feel warmth from the other side. John was speaking, but to her it was only murmurs in the distance. She turned her head delicately, placed her ear against the surface, closing her eyes. Movement? Hey! John's voice broke her focus, waking her as if from a trance. Over here. She turned. John was bent over a mound of dirt next to the farthest grave. Charlie started towards him, but he put up a hand to stop her. No, come around the other way. She carefully made her way around the perimeter of the little room until she was beside him. At first she couldn't tell what he was trying to show her. Something was almost visible, veiled in a thin layer of dirt, so it blended into the ground as if deliberately camouflaged. But eventually she saw it. Rusted metal, and the glint of a staring plastic eye. She glanced at John, who just looked back at her. This was her territory now. Carefully, Charlie poked the mostly buried head of the thing with the toe of her sneaker, then yanked her foot back. The thing didn't move. What the heck is this? John asked, glancing around the room. And why is it here? I've never seen this before, Charlie said. She knelt curiously, overtaking her fear, then used her hand to scrape aside some of the dirt, clearing out the little more of the creature's face. Behind her, John drew a sharp breath. Charlie just stared down. The creature had no fur, and its face was smooth. It had a soft muzzle and oval ears sticking out from the side of its head. It had the general appearance of an animal's head, though much larger than the animatronic animals from Freddy's. Charlie couldn't guess what kind of animal it was supposed to be. Running down the center of its face was a long, straight split, exposing wires and a line of metal frame. A thick plastic material was stuck to the face in large patches. Maybe it had been encased in it at some point. Do you recognize it? John asked quietly. Charlie shook her head. No, she managed to say after a moment. Something's wrong with it. She brushed back some dirt and found it came away easily. The thing had only been partially buried beneath the floor. That, or it had almost escaped. She started digging her hands into the dirt, trying to pry it out of what remained of its grave. You've got to be kidding me, John groaned as he knelt to help, getting his hands around any part of it he could. And one concentrated effort, they heaved upward, managing to pull most of the torso out of the dirt. They let it drop, then fell back to the ground to study it while they caught their breath. Like the face, the body was smoother than the animatronics that Charlie was used to. It had no fur, no tail, or other animal appendages. It was too large for a human being to wear, probably 8 feet tall when standing. Still, Charlie couldn't shake the feeling that she recognized this creature. Foxy. There was something sick about the creature, a weirdness that gripped her at the most basic, primal level and cried, "This is wrong." Charlie closed her eyes for a moment. Her skin felt strange, like something was crawling all over it. It's just an oversized doll. She took a deep, deliberate breath, opened her eyes, and inched forward to examine the thing. As her hand touched the creature, a wave of nausea hit her, but it lasted only a split second. She continued. She turned her head to the side, its joints resisting. The left side of its skull had been crushed. Charlie could see that the insides were broken, half the wires torn out. Just behind the eye, on the other side that had been completely buried, a piece of casing was missing. She could see a mass of plastic with a tangle of wires running in and out of it. Something had melted one of the circuit boards. Moving slowly down the body, Charlie examined its joints. One arm seemed fine, but the other, both the shoulder and elbow joints, had been bent out of shape. She looked up at John, who was watching her with a worried expression. Anything familiar? I don't recognize it. It's not something my dad ever showed me, Charlie said. Maybe we should put it back in the ground and get out of here. This feels like it was a mistake. But on the inside, Charlie ignored him. The hardware, the joints, it's older technology. Maybe he made them earlier? I don't know. How can you tell? I recognize some of this as my dad's work. She frowned and pointed at the creature's head. But then a lot of it is foreign to me. Someone else may have had a hand in it. I'm not sure if my dad made it or not, but I have a feeling he's the one who buried it. I can't imagine it was designed to be on stage. It's hideous. John was noticeably nervous, and now he placed his hand on Charlie's arm. Let's get out of here. This place gives me the creeps. Gives me the creeps, Charlie said lightly. Who says that? I'm going to try and get it the rest of the way out. I just want to see. She moved away from John's touch, laying down to dig again by the creature's buried torso. Charlie! John cried, just as a metal shriek rang out. The animatronic's arm lifted, and its chest opened like an iron gate. Its metal pieces slid out of place to reveal a dark, gaping pit, where sharp spikes and spring locks were just barely visible. It was a trap waiting to be triggered. Yet, disorientingly, something else about it had transformed at the same time. Its artificial skin took on a luminescence, and its movements were fluid and sure. Its casing suddenly appeared to have skin and fur, though they were blurry, flickering like a trick of the light. Charlie jumped backwards, but it was too late. The thing had her in its grip and lifted her high into the air. It was pulling her towards it. She beat against its bent and damaged arm, but the other arm steadily forced her closer to the chest cavity. John stumbled backwards for a moment, bending forward with one hand over his mouth, as if struck by a wave of nausea. Charlie struggled to break free, but her strength was no match for the creature. Out of the corner of her eye, she could see John lunging towards the beast. He grabbed its head, wrenching at it, trying to force it sideways. Beneath Charlie, the animatronic began to spasm and stuttering, uncontrolled movement. The creature's grip came loose, and its arm swung around wildly. Charlie struggled to get to her feet, but her legs slid in the dirt. The creature seized her again, and its cold fingers drew her closer. Charlie braced her shoe against the ground, trying to give herself leverage, but she was being pulled down by an overwhelming force. Suddenly, she was face to face with the beast, her shoulder already inside its chest cavity. The thing pressed her closer, then suddenly it jerked and released her. She rolled away and heard the sound of snapping spring locks. The creature convulsed on the ground in front of her, headless. Charlie looked at John. He was holding the thing's head in his hands, his eyes wide with shock. He dropped it and kicked it across the floor. Are you okay? John scrambled to her. Charlie nodded, staring at the broken animatronic head. It still seemed alive. Its fur bristled and its skin moved, as if there was muscle and sinew underneath. What the heck just happened? John raised both hands in surrender. Charlie carefully picked up the massive head and flipped it upside down, peering into it through the base where John had torn it off. Ugh. John bent over, his hands on his knees. His face was pale. He stifled a retching sound. Charlie started towards him, surprised. What's wrong with you? You've seen worse than this. No, it's not that. I don't know what it is. He straightened, then stumbled towards the wall, bracing himself. It's like there's some horrible smell in the air, but without the smell. Charlie held her finger to her ear, listening. There was a tone in the air, so high-pitched and quiet it was almost imperceptible. I think something is still on, she said. She set the giant head on the ground, and John had a hand to his ear, listening, but when she looked at him, he shook his head. I can't hear anything. Charlie returned to the body of the creature and peered into its gaping chest cavity. Are you okay? She asked half-heartedly, not taking her eyes off the robot. Yeah, I feel better back here. He heaved, and she turned. John's face was stained, and his arms were tight across his stomach. I think it's passing, he said, then doubled over, barely getting out the last syllable. This thing, Charlie clenched her teeth and jerked her weight back and forth, trying to wrestle something loose from inside the chest cavity. Charlie, get away from it! John took a step towards her, then swayed back as if he was tethered to the wall. There is something really wrong with that thing. Now this, I've seen before, Charlie said as she pulled the object out at last. It was a flat disc, about the size of a half-dollar coin. She held it up to her ear. Wow, that's really high-pitched. I can barely hear it. The sound is why you feel sick. Charlie wedged her fingernail into the small groove on the side of the object and flipped a thin switch. John took several deep breaths, then stood upright again, slowly testing himself. He looked at Charlie. It stopped, she said. Charlie, John whispered, nodding towards the beast on the ground. Charlie looked and and shock went through her. The illusion of the fur and flesh was gone. It was nothing more than a broken robot with unfinished features. John picked up the head once again, turning it to face them. The thing, it did something, John said, nodding towards the device in Charlie's hand. Turn it back on. He lifted the creature's head a bit higher and stared into its lifeless round eyes. Are you sure that's a good idea? She was about to say, but curiosity got the better of her. John could handle a little more nausea. She slipped her nails back into the groove and flipped the tiny switch. Before their eyes, the fractured and worn face became fluid and smooth, warping into something lifelike. John dropped the head and jumped backwards. It's alive! No, it's not, Charlie whispered, flipping the switch off again. She cradled the strange device in her hands, gazing down at it, mesmerized. I want to know more about this. We had to get back to the dorm. She got to her feet. I've seen something like this. When I came back here for Theodore, I grabbed a bunch of stuff and put it in a box to study later. I know I saw something like this. For a long moment, John said nothing. Charlie felt an urge of shame. He was looking at her the way Jessica had, the way he had when he first saw her experiment. The little disc in Charlie's palm felt suddenly like the most vital thing in the world. She closed her hand on it. Okay, then, John said plainly. Let's go. His tone was calm, and it caught Charlie off guard. John was being deliberately agreeable. She wasn't sure exactly why, but it was reassuring nonetheless. Okay, Charlie smiled. And that's the end of chapter 6, so I hope you guys enjoyed. It's definitely getting interesting with the fact that they have fur with the illusion disc. So, definitely interesting. I will see you guys in the next video. Bye-bye.